Held over one afternoon each August in aid of children in need, the Little Gransden Air and Car Show is one of the quirkier events on the British airshow circuit, always attracting a selection of classic aircraft that we don't often see elsewhere. 2021 was no exception, with the likes of the Yak-3 UTI, Spartan Executive and Stinson Reliant making their only flying display appearances of the year so far. They appeared alongside a host of aerobatic acts, Rich Goodwin, the AeroSuperBatics Wingwalkers, Cap 10 and more. Another highlight of the show was the home team, the Global Stars, with a spectacular four-ship performance towards the end of the flying programme. This is our pick of the action. A very warm welcome on a rather cold day to the Little Gransden Air and Car Show 2021. This small grass airstrip, home to a number of classic aircraft and the Global Stars aerobatic team, is located midway between Bedford and Cambridge, and they've been holding an annual air display here for 29 years. And we're going to cut to the action straight away as we canter through what was an exceptionally busy flying programme. It ran for 4.5 hours and involved some 26 individual display items, making for a very busy afternoon of performances indeed. First up in our look back at proceedings is the team on screen now, the Red Sparrows, with a quartet of de Havilland Chipmunks, marking the 75th anniversary of that ubiquitous aircraft type. 3 of the 4 aircraft wear various iterations of Royal Air Force training schemes, but particularly unusual here is the yellow aeroplane in the colours of the Royal Canadian Air Force. This airframe is new to the UK airshow circuit this season. It's a Canadian-built example, which is not exactly common here in Britain. Most of our Chipmunks were built under licence here in the UK. And how can you tell? Well, the Canadian examples have rather more slender landing gear legs, but the most obvious difference is that large bubble canopy, which is the hallmark of the late-model Canadian airframes. On to the first of the fighters and the sole representative of the Royal Air Force, which is the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight Spitfire LF.IX. The LF stands for low flying, indicating that it is fitted with a 2-stage turbocharger optimised for operations at lower altitudes. And there's a Canadian connection here as well, because this aircraft served with the Royal Canadian Air Force, including as part of the Allied invasion of Normandy. It now, however, wears the desert camouflage of 92 Squadron Royal Air Force, stationed in Tunisia in 1943.
Final parts coming up from the Supermarine Spitfire 9 at the Royal Air Force Battle of Britain Memorial Flight.
Next up, we have the first of several locally based display participants, and this one sees Chris Burkett in the Extra 300S flying a coordinated display with a 40% scale model Extra 300 flown by Mike Williams. The two aircraft may look like they're flying in formation, but there's a good deal of separation between them, In fact, there's an imaginary line along the ground running parallel to the crowd line, and the remote control aircraft will conduct its entire display on one side of that line, while Chris displays solely on the opposite side. Weighing just 18 kilograms, the Model Extra has a power-to-weight ratio of well in excess of 1:1, making it possible for it to hang stationary in the air. And indeed, it's only the slightly unrealistic flight characteristics that make it possible to tell which of the two aircraft is the model at some points during the display.
Down the line, a series of rolls, there's a hesitation roll there. One way then the other once again on the display. It's putting down the head quite likewise. They have matched their speed. Better
Now it's time to take a look at the second of the three Spitfires that participated in the flying programme, and this is an airframe we haven't seen out on the airshow circuit for several years. It's a PR-19, PR standing for Photo Reconnaissance, and it forms part of the Rolls-Royce Heritage Flight based at East Midlands Airport. Chris Hadlow is flying it here in exceptional style. This one was built in 1945 and flew a number of missions over enemy territory, most notably gathering data on V1 and V2 launch sites. It later went on to be a founding member of the RAF's Battle of Britain flight in 1957, now the BBMF of course, and it has been in the custodianship of Rolls-Royce since the 1990s. The next aircraft is a new addition to the Rolls-Royce stable, although a very familiar asset on the British airshow circuit, P-51D Mustang Warhorse, previously operated by the Norwegian Spitfire Foundation. It wears the colours of Colonel Donald Blatesky's aircraft. He was the commander of the US Army Air Force 4th Fighter Group, and he flew more combat missions than any other American fighter pilot during the Second World War. The aircraft is flown here by Adam Landau, the former F-16 and F-35 pilot with the Royal Norwegian Air Force, and now a prolific Warbird display pilot. Just by pure coincidence, it so happens that there were a good number of aircraft at Little Gransden that we've already seen this year, including a handful which we covered in rather better conditions at the Midlands Air Festival, that's Series 4, Episode 2. Paul Freeland's Sci-I Marchetti F260 is among them, as is Rich Goodwin in his modified Pitts S2E, the wonderful Tiger 9 aeronautical display team, and the Oster and Chipmunk of the Gypsy pair. We won't be looking at any of those acts in detail in this episode, and I'm also very sad to be skimming over Stu Blanchard's wonderful Miles Gemini display. It was, for me, the highlight of the day, but unfortunately I was in the middle of moving my camera setup at the time to get out of the way of some aircraft movements on the ground, and for that I can only apologise. But on to something which we can see in considerably more detail, and it's time for an overseas visitor in the form of Christophe Simon, with this delightful display in the Mudry Cap 10 belonging to the Tiger Club. Christophe is spending the summer displaying here in the UK. He's previously performed at Duxford and Old Buckenham this summer, and that's in part because the French airshow and aerobatic scene is heavily biased towards current and former military pilots. The entire French competition aerobatic team, for example, is part of the French Air and Space Force. The Cap 10 first flew in 1968 and remained in production until 2007. This isn't quite an original Cap 10 though, it's a Cap 10C with a carbon fibre wing spar and enlarged ailerons, which allows for a faster than usual roll rate, particularly at lower airspeeds. The Cap 10 was then further developed into the Cap 20 and Cap 21, which is a single-seat version of the Cap 10 built for the French Air Force's competition aerobatics unit, the Équipe de Voltige. Only 12 of those were built, and it was then very quickly replaced by a yet more advanced family of aircraft, the Cap 230, 231 and 232. We talked about that family in great detail in the previous episode. The Équipe de Voltige now fly the Extra 330 SC, however. We'll be seeing that aircraft type in the hands of Mark Jeffries in a few minutes' time, and being flown by the Équipe de Voltige themselves in the next episode of Airshow Dispatches. From a pilot who is new to us on the British Airshow circuit to an absolute stalwart of the scene over the last few decades, in the form of the AeroSuperBatics wingwalkers, with company owner Vic Norman and long-standing team pilot Dave Barrell at the controls. One week after this performance, the white aircraft was involved in a forced water landing at the Bournemouth Air Festival. Thanks to a brilliant bit of flying, nobody was badly hurt, but depending on what state the aircraft is in, Little Gransden may well have been its penultimate airshow appearance, at least for the foreseeable future. Now the two wingwalkers unstrap themselves from their harnesses and begin to climb back into the cockpit for landing, pausing on the way for another fly past, but they are of course still attached to the aircraft by a safety wire. Now here's something we see on the circuit very rarely indeed. Andrew Davies in the Stinson Reliant. An American design built in Detroit in 1942 in this case. This Reliant was then transferred to the Royal Navy as part of the Lend-Lease agreement. The Fleet Air Arm used them predominantly for communication duties and navigation training, and today it is the only Reliant still flying in the UK. Also used in the training role, albeit with a rather higher profile than the Reliant, is the T6 Harvard, this one being flown for us by its owner, Andrew Goodall. This one is a fairly late model, built under license in Canada in 1953, hence it being known as a Harvard rather than a Texan. It was British and therefore Canadian policy at the time to name training aircraft after famed universities, and the T-6, being an American design, was named after one of the great educational establishments of the United States. This particular aircraft then served with the Italian Air Force and came under civilian ownership in the UK in 1981. Our next display pilot holds what is called a Tyro display authorization, denoting that he's been a qualified display pilot for less than 2 years and has flown at fewer than 9 previous air displays. Airshows effectively get a small discount from the Civil Aviation Authority's administrative fees if they book a small number of Tyro DA holders to fly at their show, the idea being that it helps bring new pilots into the industry. The pilot in question in this instance is James Brown, the proud owner of Hurricane Mark 1 R4118, which is an aircraft we've seen many times on the display circuit, but never before under James's control. This was his first display in his new steed, and it is quite remarkable to see a Tyro DA holder flying quite such a complex, challenging and powerful aircraft as the Hawker Hurricane. We'll see more Hurricane action later on, but now let's look at a second P-51D Mustang, this time Miss Helen, flown by John Dodd. This is another act that we won't be looking at for too long, but if you do want to see more of Miss Helen flying in rather nicer skies, then do take a look at the previous episode, which covers one of Duxford's 2021 flying days. There were no fewer than 3 Spitfire solos at the Little Gransden Airshow 2021, and the final example in the flying programme was this rather gorgeous aircraft in the colours of the 31st Fighter Group, 309th Fighter Squadron of the United States Army Air Force, which technically would have been a Spitfire Mark 9, although this one is an LF.16E. It completed its most recent restoration to flight in 2013 and received this particular paint scheme in 2020. We've already seen one model aircraft in today's programme, but now it's time for 2 more in the form of the Reds Duo. The team is comprised of father and son Steve and Matt Bishop, and the Bishops are a big deal in the UK remote control air display scene, not just because many of them are acclaimed display pilots in their own right, but also because Steve runs the Western Park International Model Airshow, which is the largest event of its kind in the world. The Reds Duo are, of course, one of the stars of that event, but they are every bit as at home at a full-size air display as well. They've also taken the team to model air shows and competitions right around the world, even displaying as far afield as China. If there was one problem caused by the jam-packed flying program, it was that many of the display items had to be relegated to just a couple of flypasts. Such was the brevity of their slot. The Spartan Executive was one of those, sadly. It's one of a pair of Spartans based here at Little Gransden, and indeed, they had been due to perform a two-ship display had the other one not become rather sick a short time before the show. But it was, nonetheless, a rare chance to see this locally based aircraft in the air during one of only 2 UK air display appearances performed by the type this season.
The aircraft had a max range of quite a remarkable sight. Yes, there's a very high proportion of the build.
Earlier on, we saw a Hurricane Mark 1 in the hands of newbie display pilot James Brown, but now we're going to get another look at the type courtesy of Neil Oakham and the Battle of Britain veteran V7497. There are only 2 airworthy Hurricanes in the world that fought in the Battle of Britain, and this is one of them. The other, of course, is R4118, which we saw flying earlier.
Took to the aerodrome in the summer of 2018. And was now operated by Hurricane 501, a group takes its name from the squadron with which this aircraft operated 81 years ago.
And when we saw R4118, it was James Brown's Airshow debut in that type. And now we're going to take a quick look at Bob Davies' first Airshow appearance in his new Warbird, the Yak-3 UTI. Although it's on the French register, the aircraft was recently based in Belgium, and Little Gransden was its display debut as a UK resident aircraft.
In the 1980s, it went with a large batch of other Yaks, was acquired by a French organisation, and a production line was set up in Romania. As I say, this one was the prototype, and a number followed afterwards, and some of them are still around, still remaining. You know what they are?
And finally, if you will pardon the pun, we come to the stars of the show. One extra 260, one extra 300S, one dual-seat extra 300L, and one highly advanced extra 330SC, the latter being flown by the team leader Mark Jeffries. I say team leader, but it's actually Chris Heems at the front of the formation. On one wing is Steve Carver, and on the other is Chris Burkett. Mark Jeffries is for now sitting in the slot position. Now it's Chris Burkett who moves to the back. These are just 4 aircraft in the team's rather extensive fleet, and the group regularly performs solo 2- and 4-ship displays. They've also once performed as a 5-ship act. That was at the Sichuan Airshow 2019 in China, which we covered in Series 2, Episode 8. Now we get a taste of Mark Jeffrey's aerobatic prowess. As well as light aerobatic types, he's flown jet and piston-engined warbirds, and he was the first British importer of the Soviet aerobatic aircraft of the 1970s and 80s, responsible for importing the first 40 Yak-52s based in the UK.
I still think it's going to have to go a very long way to beat the performance of this aeroplane, particularly if you combine Mark's spectacular skills as an individual aerobatic pilot with an aeroplane that's come up with a 230 and going up the side of the wall.
A tricky inside-outside loop with the inner aircraft pushing -G, the outer one pulling positive. And having completed that, they will pull up into the vertical for synchronised stall turns, climbing as the airspeed bleeds away and then kicking in a bootful of rudder to pivot round their left wingtip. And of course, the rudder remains functional even at 0 airspeed because of the prop wash being induced by the propeller.
Pulling up in unison in front of us for synchronised stall turns. All the while during this display, of course, they're having to battle against the effects of the wind.
Now pulling out of that to point back at the crowds for some very snappy opposition derry turns.
Display lines. Indeed, rather than flying become just to say, well, it's just another. It's not. This is pretty special. For this similar aeroplane, for superb really superb performance of aerobatics at its best. And one that, as the team's name suggests, has been seen and enjoyed all over the world on some of the very extensive overseas tours they did, we have to say, before COVID set in, and which I'm sure they'll be doing again. Indeed, I think they're going to be on their travels again in the next few months.
And all 4 aircraft now pull up for the final manoeuvre. The Global Stars, I believe, the only civilian aerobatic team in the world to do this, the Double Heart. Of course, this being the British summer, we endured some pretty dreary weather during the day, only for the clouds to then break a few minutes after the flying display ended and reveal a glorious blue sky. So before we wrap up the episode, enjoy some of the departures that took place at the end of the flying programme in rather nicer conditions. That is it for this episode. Next time we're in France for the brilliant Air Legend 2021, focusing on World War II in the Pacific. It's a good one, don't miss it. But until then, it has been a pleasure to talk you through the show at Little Gransden. From me, Adam Landau, it's goodbye for now.